We all know that the Attorney General position can be really critical when there's no one else, no real decider. And we've had a lot of that in this state where the decider was the Attorney General, and the Attorney General changed the course of many events in our state in the last 2 years. So we want to welcome Sharon, who is going to be Sharon Doviet, who is an attorney here in the city of Huntsville, who most of you recognize Sharon because she's been in Huntsville forever, and she started out in media and became an attorney here, a local attorney, and she's going to serve as our moderator tonight. We're thrilled to have her here. And just a little bit I would like to say about Christie and Joseph Siegelman before they get started. When we start, they'll have an opportunity to introduce themselves, and then we'll have a series of questions. Sharon has a few questions in advance, and there are bright yellow index cards over on the table and pens. If you think that you have a particular question that you need to write down, please do that and hand it to me or Pam, or there are several of us in the audience, but I'll be in the back. You can bring it to me and we'll pass it straight to Sharon, and then she can look at those cards and pick up with some of your questions and concerns, because that's what we're here for, is to hear what you have to say and hear what the candidates have to say. I'll introduce Christie. He is has lived in Alabama all of his life. He had some interesting background. When I was reading about you, Chris, and I realized that you served in the Peace Corps, that fascinated me. A life-changing event that trains your heart and mind for service, and he did serve in the Peace Corps. Chris is a family man. I met his wife Donna. She's in the audience. Donna's in the audience tonight as well. And I understand, Chris, you have 3 children, right? Chris and Joseph too, I'm sure, are very concerned about cleaning up the state, getting rid of corruption. Alabama is notorious for its corruption, sadly. And that means we need to build a culture, according to Chris, of changing the ethics in Montgomery. For me personally, my soapbox is we need 2 parties in this state. And as long as we're ruled by one party, we're never going to be able to have a balance of power that kind of keeps people in check and on their toes. So we welcome Chris here. And we also welcome Joseph Siegelman. Joseph's an attorney in Birmingham. And he is also concerned about public service, about the common good. Those are his priorities. Joseph works for the Cochran firm. Is that correct, Joseph? In Birmingham. He's lived in Alabama all of his life as well, attended the University of Alabama. So we've got lots of lawyers in the house with Sharon, Chris, and Joseph, and I look forward to hearing from them. As a mother of 2 attorneys, I have a lot of questions, too many. So, you know, I'll be listening and raising my hand maybe, but we really appreciate you all being here, and I want to get started. Feel free if you need to get up and have a refreshment. Don't hesitate to do so. Please feel free to join us with Madison County Democratic Women. We have little index cards over there if you want us to get in touch with you. We are a very, very growing organization. Madison County Democratic Women actually has been around since the 60s. We were formed in the 60s when the women who were Democrats wanted to elect JFK, and the men were marginalizing them, so they said, oh, okay, no problem. So the organization's been around for over 50 years. And we have a scholarship that we award every year to a high school student. They write an essay, and we vet those. We've been going through that process over the last several months. And next Thursday night, we will award a JFK scholarship to a local high school student who is a student at Hazel Green High School. Correct, Pam?
Yes.
Who was chosen. I'd like to also add that our keynote speaker will be our Senator Doug Jones. So that is very exciting. You can go to our website or our Facebook account, or you can take my business card off the table and get tickets to join us at our dinner. It'll be at the Ledges. It'll be a beautiful venue and a fantastic experience, and really a great chance for us to support our scholarship fund. super important to help all these young people. They're stepping up, and it's time for us to step up. We need to sustain that scholarship and build on it, add to it, because the young people are leading us, and we just need to let them do it. I'm excited about that. So I'm going to leave the podium, because clearly I could keep talking, and let Sharon take charge, and join us next Thursday night. We look forward to seeing some of you there.
Raise your hand if they couldn't pay you enough money to run for state office in the state of Alabama. Here's to those of you who are stepping out there and taking the lead. Somebody has got to do it, and if good people don't do it, who's going to do it? The folks who are left, right? We're going to start by giving each of our candidates 2 minutes to sort of introduce and things you haven't already heard today. We'll start left to right. Christie, would you give us 2 minutes about you?
So my name is Chris Christie. I want to guarantee you that I am the original Chris Christie. Born 2 years before the guy who's tried to take my name. I was born and raised here in Alabama. Went off to school when I was at Duke, getting a master's degree and a law degree. I met and married my wife, Donna, who's here. During that same time period, I actually was in someone's wedding who is here also. Leanne Pasker is back here, and Leanne is married to my best friend from high school. Something I don't often mention is John and I played football together in high school, and he was the tackle and I was the outside linebacker right next to him, and we had a football team that did not lose a game my junior or senior year. We were ranked number 3 in the nation. I don't normally mention that, but because I see Leanne, I just thought I would throw that in.
Sorry, he's not here. He would love to talk about that.
You know, when I graduated from law school, my wife and I joined the Peace Corps. She worked for the National Center for Rehabilitation of the Handicapped in Yaoundé, Cameroon, which is in West Africa, and I taught at the University of Yaoundé School of Law. Then we came back to my home, to Alabama, where I practiced for 30 years for the same law firm. My wife and I were at some social events, and people were talking about the governor who had recently left office, and the Speaker of the House who had been convicted of a dozen felonies, and the Chief Justice who had been removed from office. And the question was, why can't we get good people to run for government? Run for state office. And so I was having my devotional one morning, and I came in and I told my wife, it is time. And she knew, because of the involvement that I'd had in politics while we were dating mostly, but when we were just married, what I was talking about. And what am I qualified to do? I've been a lawyer for 30 years, got the experience to be Attorney General. It was interesting. Already time? I thought I had 15 second warning. All right.
Give him 15. Give him 15.
Give him another 15.
All right. One last thing I was going to mention is that after I talked to my wife and my pastor and a small group of people, which included Doug Jones got me to come up here to a political event in this very building. And as we were coming up, he knew that I was thinking about running for Attorney General, was sort of planning to, but hadn't made up my mind. When I got here, he got into that big building. When he stood up and gave the talk that he gave, the first thing he did was he introduced me as the next Attorney General of Alabama. So this is March of 2017. So anyway, thank y'all, and I'm more than willing to give 30 extra seconds to
yields his time.
Joseph Siegelman, welcome.
First off, it's a pleasure to be here with y'all. I want to thank the Madison County Democratic Women for hosting this event, and it's especially nice to be back here with y'all. I came to a luncheon a few weeks ago. It's good to be back. But my name is Joe Siegelman. I'm also a candidate for Attorney General. I am an attorney at the Cochran firm in Birmingham, and I have been since I graduated law school at the University of Alabama, where I also attended for undergrad, and born and raised Alabama. I know that many of you in this room are familiar with my family. I'm proud to be my parents' son, not just my father. I'm proud to be my mother's son, if not more so than my father. And she actually came out to her first political event last night in Hoover, and it was wonderful to have her sort of on the campaign trail with me. But I look forward to hearing the questions you have. I want to make sure that each of you get to know me. I see a lot of familiar faces For those of you who have any questions for me after, I plan on sticking around after, but this is an incredibly important election for the Attorney General. This is an even more important election for the state of Alabama. We have a great opportunity in front of us. And it's not only possible, but it is plausible to reshape the face of the state of Alabama. And I want to echo what the introduction had said, that young people are taking a stand. They are making their voice heard. And we need to make sure that we are amplifying that voice. And I hope to help be that voice. I look forward to working with you and hopefully for you as your next Attorney General. Thank you for having me.
Let's start with Joe. Can a Democrat win this office, and what's it going to take for a Democrat to win this office?
Well, the short answer is yes, absolutely. And I don't think, as some people have said, that it requires magic to strike again. I don't believe it was magic that struck back in December. I know there are a lot of people in this room who worked incredibly hard that got Doug Jones elected into the Senate. And I don't think I need to impress upon anyone in here that we cannot be complacent. We cannot be satisfied. We have a lot of good candidates running up and down the ticket, some of whom are in this room. And it's not that we owe it to them, it's not that we owe it to the Democratic Party, it's that we owe it to the state of Alabama to continue this work and continue pushing the ball in the right direction. I have seen it everywhere I have been. I see it tonight. The energy, the enthusiasm, the motivation from voters from Walker County, Marengo County, Madison County, they are everywhere. And I come away only more encouraged, more inspired, more energized everywhere I go because of that. And there are additional Democratic voters out there. There are those in Madison County who just want to be heard. They want to know that they're represented. They want to know that there are people willing to hear their issues and act on them. I intend to be that candidate for them. And I'm going to work as hard as I can every day to make that pledge a reality.
Chris, can a Democrat win this seat, and what's it going to take to do that?
Yes. The answer to the question is yes. A Democrat can win this seat. As a matter of fact, the Attorney General's office is the second most important statewide office in the state, and for public safety and many issues, it is the most important office. Now, in Mississippi and in Kentucky, right now, there's one statewide office holder. It is a Democrat, and it is the Attorney General. From 2012 to 16 in North Carolina, that was true also. And so there really is an opportunity here. All of those three, in the Attorney Generals, Jim Hood in Mississippi, Andy Beshear in Kentucky, and Roy Cooper in North Carolina, ran on a platform of addressing public corruption. And they were able to win that race because people understood that a Democrat in those red states was going to be able to do things about public corruption, government corruption, that they needed to have done in that state. And so that is part of what we need. And Alabama is last or almost last in every category that matters. And if we had a football team that was last or almost last every year, what would we do?
Get a new coach.
All right, so we start looking for a new coach. What do you need in the new coach? You need a new coach who has got the experience and the track record and have been winning over their career so that you can bring them in and change the program. And that's what we need in Alabama. We need an Attorney General, a Democratic candidate for Attorney General, and then an Attorney General who's got a winning record, who's had success, and people can see has got the experience necessary to do the job.
Have either one of you ever held public office before?
No, ma'am.
No, I have not.
Have either of you ever worked in the Attorney General's office?
No, and frankly, I'll be honest with you, I think if you have worked in these past Attorney General's office, that ought to disqualify you for seeking.
You say that, yeah, go ahead.
All right, so the answer to the question is no, I have not worked in the Attorney General's office. I think one thing you have to realize is the Attorney General supervises about 80 lawyers and 100 staff, and about 2/3 of those are civil servants, and they're still going to be there. You're not going to be able to change all of the people that work in the Attorney General's office if you get elected to be, as a Democrat, the Attorney General. But yes.
How does the Attorney General's office affect the average Alabamian? If they do, on a typical daily basis, are average Alabamians affected, and how? Let's start with Chris this time.
The answer to the question is yes, it does affect the typical Alabamian. And it really, the way that you can see it is two things. And one, the two issues that I think are most important are government corruption and public safety. Now, government corruption, if you don't address government corruption, we're not going to have good government. And I could spend a whole hour talking about that issue. And on public safety, that really involves two things. It involves crime and corrections. And crime, obviously, everybody's affected by crime in their community. But corrections really is a misnomer in Alabama because we don't provide rehabilitation to people in prison.
That's right.
We don't do things so when people get out of prison, which 80 or 90% of the people in prison are going to get out, so they stay out of prison. We have one of the highest return to prison rates in the country. And so then you add to that we don't have the drug treatment, the mental health treatment, and we have nonviolent offenders in prison. And so just think about how that affects everyone. Almost everybody has someone who has those types of issues in their family. And if we don't provide the support and the services that those people need to stay out of prison, then we're all going to be losing. And look, the individuals who go to prison lose. The taxpayers lose because it costs $20,000 a year to have somebody in prison. And frankly, the state of Alabama loses because instead of having those people contribute to society, contribute to the community, they're locked up in a warehouse where they're held and not provided what they need to have, so when they get out, they don't return to prison again. So again, yes, the Attorney General's office has a very important role in how the laws are applied and developing the laws that we need and just helping with public safety in the state of Alabama.
Joe, how does the Attorney General affect the average Alabamian?
I would answer the question slightly differently. I would say the office can have an impact, a positive impact on people's lives. I think one of the most important changes that needs to be made in the Attorney General's office is the mindset of what priorities are undertaken out of that office. I'll give you one example. This current Attorney General has brought a lawsuit to protect Confederate monuments. I don't know how that affects people. You know, I know that there's sewage in people's yards in Lowndes County. You know, I know that we are currently spending taxpayer dollars to make our communities less safe for some of the reasons that my opponent just pointed out. You know, there are people in prison who don't need to be in prison. You know, 90% of the people who are currently in prison will get out of prison at some point. There are no rehabilitative services. We have a 71% recidivism rate because we don't take care of the people who are in there. And so in short, it absolutely can. It can have a tremendous impact. But only if our priorities are in the right place. My slogan for the campaign is much more than a slogan. It's people, not politics. We have to remember that the job of the Attorney General is to serve the people of Alabama. And I'll be honest, part of my motivation for running is I don't see that happen. But it can and should be happening.
Is everybody passing around their cards? You are invited to write down questions and pass them in. How do we pay for these things? So our forensic labs are, for the most part, closed, way behind. Mental health facilities for prisoners, treatment is significantly decreased in recent years. And you're talking about drug treatment, you're talking about rehab. How does the state of Alabama pay for that?
Is this
Either
go to
one.
me?
Yeah, let's start with Joe.
Well, I'll say money is always going to be an issue. And I think this also goes back to priorities. You know, right now, and I heard Dr. Boyd, who's running for Lieutenant Governor, talk about this. We spend twice as much on our prisons as we do on education in this state. That's wrong. And there's got to be the right priorities. We spent, out of the Attorney General's office, we spent tens of millions of dollars fighting the gambling issue, which as we now know is basically a non-issue. And it should have been from the beginning. If those resources, the resources that are allocated to protecting Confederate monuments, were actually allocated into drug courts, rehabilitative services, diversion programs, then we may have the resources to tackle the issues. But it all begins with that mindset I'm talking about, which is serving the people of Alabama and not any political agenda. And that's what needs to change more than anything. When we do that, we're going to find the funds. We're going to be able to move the legislature in the right direction to make some of these changes. And that's what's got to be done. That's the first step.
But the Attorney General's office doesn't control those monies, right? And reallocate them. Can it be done with the budget that the Attorney General's office has?
The Attorney General doesn't make or change the law, or there are very few opportunities for that to happen. The most important job of the Attorney General is the administration of justice in the criminal justice system, the civil justice system, and to do that fairly, equally, and impartially. Now, there are going to be opportunities where the Attorney General can have some influence on the legislature. There will be legislation that is introduced, and the Attorney General can help push certain legislation forward, and I think that that is a voice that the Attorney General can have and an impact the Attorney General can have. And I hope that there will be opportunities to do that, but the most important job is to be impartial and fair with the laws that are currently on the books and make sure that we administer justice in the fashion that I just talked about, fairly, equally, and impartially.
Chris, you were talking about
I have a question for either one of you.
Let me let Chris answer it. Let me take your question and I'll read it off because I want to make sure that we give Chris the same opportunity to answer that question.
This is one thing. So, I agree.
Let me let you finish and then we'll take your question. Chris, talk to us. Would you like a chance to address that, how we pay for it, the very things that you said we need?
Yes. So how do we pay for the types of services that we don't have? It's cheaper to provide drug treatment than it is to have somebody in prison.
That's right.
It's cheaper to have mental health treatment than it is to have someone in prison. You know, it's like having a house and not fixing the roof. And say, well, we can't afford to fix the roof. But the next thing you know, you've got mold in the sheetrock and you've got warped floors. And that's what we've done in Alabama. We have not spent money taking care of what we need to, drug treatment, mental health treatment. Now, nonviolent offenders. It's crazy that a person with simple marijuana possession can get arrested and put in prison. I had a young man come up to me. He was 29 years old. And when he was 21, he got arrested with one joint, one marijuana cigarette. He got convicted of a felony. As a consequence of that, he had a 9-year sentence, and he served 7 of those 9 years. So instead of finishing college in 4 years like he had planned to, he spent 7 years in prison learning nothing other than how criminals behave. Now, if we change where we put our resources and don't be so short-sighted, yes, we can afford to do these things without a major change in the revenues that we have in the state of Alabama. So the answer to your question is, it's because prisons, locking people up, is so expensive. Now, there are 3 class actions pending against the state of Alabama right now, and they're going to force the state to change the prisons. And they're going to require the state eventually to have twice as many guards as we have. And so the problems we have in funding the prisons is actually going to get much worse because the federal courts are pressuring the prisons to do that right now. And so, you know, as we go forward, you know, what are we going to do? Are we going to have changes in the law, changes in how the law is applied, do things that so Alabama can move forward? Or are we going to just keep locking everybody up?
Tell us your name and what's your question.
My name is Roy Simmons. I'm an independent. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican. But I voted Democrat for the last 45 years.
We'll take it. Your exception.
He was my webmaster in my campaign.
Luther Strange, who was a Republican guy, was the best attorney general this state's had in my mind. I had fights with AT&T, Comcast, Knology, Mediacom. Every one of them is solved. AT&T's office in California personally called me and offered me, you know, like a whole bunch of benefits. It didn't work, so why would you want those?
So what's your question to our candidates?
So what are you guys going to do? I'm a graphic designer, photographer for 40 plus years. You know, we used to buy CDs that had software. You got your software, you used it, you marketed Huntsville, the first heart monitor, the first inkjet printer, the first, you know, everything that is the first, you know, the guy on the move. We did that. This is something.
So what's your question? What's your question to our candidate?
Can you go sit down? I apologize.
Do you
So, yeah,
agree?
my
No, sit
question
down.
is, you know, what are you going to do? The guy that replaced Luther Strange, in any complaint after Luther was in office, which.
Let's boil that down, okay? Do you agree that Luther
Unbiasedly,
Strange did a good job, a
he did
decent
good
job in that position?
So, what are you going to do to help the rest of us that are consumers? I market consumer products, you know, the people that are consumers, that's everybody out there.
Okay,
You know,
thank you,
we
sir. Do you feel like Luther Strange performed well in that position? Joe?
I want to say a couple things. First, I want to just add a touch to the last question and the answer that was given. We've got to be proactive and not reactive, and the issue regarding funding is perhaps even more dire than was stated, which is these courts are going to force us to make the changes that are necessary. And if that money doesn't come out of the general fund, the only other place it can come from is the education trust fund. And so that is how critically important it is to make sure that we prioritize our funding and actually take proactive measures to solve these problems. Sir, thank you for your question. And I want to
support your dad.
Well, thank you. I hope you'll support me. One of the principles that I am running on, and I firmly believe this. As everyone in this room knows, I come from a Democratic family. I'm a proud Democrat. I'm running as a Democrat and wouldn't run as anything else. But this office requires a level of independence that is unique to other elected offices. In my view, it's entirely a non-political office, and to the extent it isn't, it should be. And so we have to have an independent as Attorney General. And it shouldn't matter whether you run as a Republican or you run as a Democrat, you've got to be an independent. That's what the office really requires. As to Attorney General Luther Strange, there's been talk about experience, and my experience. I'm actually proud of the experience I have. I am proud to have gone to work for a firm that represents individuals who are fighting every day to solve legal problems through the court system and to be there for those individuals. And I'm a trial lawyer. What I do every day is get into court or litigate cases that are going through the court system and go to bat for these people. And anyway, it's been a real privilege, and I want to bring that passion and commitment to the Attorney General's office. And the reason I bring that up now is because our last Attorney General was a lobbyist. He had never been in the courtroom, never tried a case. My experience vastly exceeds our last elected Attorney General. And I certainly have disagreements, and I'm glad to hear that you had success with consumer protection with the last Attorney General. That has to be a focus for every Attorney General.
Chris, can I give you a different question from the audience? Is that okay? Do either of you have interest in abolishing earnest resistance, considering it only promotes rape culture and protects rapists? Anybody got thoughts on Criminal Code 13A 660? If nobody
Mr.
has-
Christie, I invite you to...
How about juvenile justice in the state of Alabama? Do you feel like young criminals accused are getting fair treatment and are they getting justice in the state of Alabama? Would you seek to reform the way our juvenile accused are treated?
So the answer to the question is yes. I would try to make changes in the way juvenile justice is done. I was president of the Legal Aid Society, which provides lawyers in the family courts for juveniles. I've actually represented juveniles in family court myself who were accused of, if they had been in the adult system, would have been crimes. In Birmingham, just this past week, there was a newspaper article about a 15-year-old child, right? Because at 15 years old, you're still a child. And he had been involved in a burglary where one of the other people who was an adult who had been in the burglary ended up getting shot and killed. So when the police came, there was some resistance, and one of the people who was participating in the crime got killed. That young man was convicted as an adult of felony murder, which just means because there was a felony going on and somebody got killed, everybody involved was responsible for the murder. That 15-year-old got a 65-year sentence. That's wrong. We should not have laws that allow the discretion to be applied in that way. And I hate to say this, but what do you think that young man looked like? Do you think his skin color was the same as mine?
No.
All right, and because you allow the discretion to have the laws applied in that way, you do not have justice when you have a 15-year-old who's given a 65-year sentence. And we need to change the laws so those kinds of things do not happen. Another part of this, it's a real problem, is that there's some counties where they don't segregate the juveniles from the adult criminals, right? So somebody gets arrested and they put the 15-year-old in with the adults. And of course, that's unsafe for the juvenile during the time that they're there. And what are they learning while they're in there in jail with those other people? So yes, there needs to be changes, and I've tried to give you just a flavor of a couple of things that we need to do.
Joe, would you agree change is needed?
I absolutely do agree change is needed, and my opponent highlighted some of them. When I think about juvenile justice, I don't think about it just in terms of interaction with the criminal justice system. And we have got to make sure that every individual, regardless of where you're born or to whom, has the same opportunities, has the same the same opportunity for hope and achievement that any other person has. And when those individuals do come into contact with the criminal justice system, my slogan is people, not politics. And when we investigate and prosecute, we have to keep in mind that we are investigating and prosecuting crimes, not people. But when it comes to sentencing, you've got to remember you're sentencing people, not crimes. And I think that is most true in the case of juvenile cases, because as my opponent touched on, I firmly believe that it's wrong to put a 16-year-old in prison with fully grown men who are hardened criminals. And that goes back to an earlier discussion of rehabilitation. That ought to be the goal of the justice system. Punishment always will be a part of it, but we have to recognize that these are people, and we have to recognize that it is our responsibility to try to help and aid those people.
Does the Attorney General's office have control over that, making those changes, or influence? How much difference can the Attorney General make in these changes that you're talking about? Either one of you.
I think the Attorney General can have an incredible amount of influence. The Attorney General is largely seen and known as the top law enforcement officer. And the Attorney General can set standards for the state that, and directives to district attorneys. And you're right, the Attorney General, as I've noted before, can't make the law and can't really change the law, but the Attorney General has a whole lot of authority. And one of those comes in appellate decisions in cases. All appeals for cases that are tried in the county level or district level will go through the Attorney General's office. And so we have an opportunity to reevaluate cases, decide which cases that we want to take on appeal and uphold the convictions, or not. And so there are opportunities, and I think certainly there's some common sense legislation that I would back as Attorney General and exercise whatever influence I could to try to help legislatures see, like what we talked about, that we're spending tax dollars making our citizens and our communities less safe. Certain legislation can help change that. But I think there are opportunities now that the Attorney General can take now that aren't currently being done because it's not a priority.
Chris, how much power or influence does the Attorney General have over making the changes you're talking about?
The Attorney General does not have control. He does have considerable influence, and frankly the most influential elected official in the state over these issues. But you have to recognize district attorneys in each county are elected locally, and as Attorney General, you can't tell that district attorney what to do. You do have certain ways that you can influence what they do. You can influence them just through education, through persuasion, through how you control the appellate process, because the Attorney General's office does handle all of the appeals. But almost all crimes are pled, and there aren't appeals almost ever from cases where someone pleads guilty. So what do you have to do? Really, the Attorney General, in order to have the most influence, has to get to the legislature and convince the legislature to change these laws. I mean, an example is marijuana, right? Alabama is one of the few states where marijuana is a felony. There are more states where it's legal to smoke marijuana than it is where it's a felony, and at a minimum we need to go to where it's a misdemeanor. But no one should go to prison for simple possession of marijuana, all right? And so, you know, you can talk about decriminalization and sort of you get bogged down into what that means. But the bottom line is, right, no one should go to prison for simple possession of marijuana. We need an Attorney General who will go and convince the legislature that it's in the individual's interest who gets arrested, it's in the taxpayer's interest, which is an issue that the legislatures typically listen to, and it's in Alabama's interest not to be locking up people for that type of nonviolent crime. So that's just an example of where the Attorney General needs to have the influence and go in, needs to be somebody that the legislatures will listen to and will be able to persuade the legislatures about the changes that need to be made.
I'm going to remind everybody we've got cards that if anybody wants to write down questions and pass them in, raise your hand and somebody will bring you a card. We'll ask your question particularly, okay? Shoot, Janet will bring you a card. The new ethics law change that's sort of redefining a lobbyist. Can we let each of you take a stab at that? Good change, bad change? Do you think it's going to make any difference at all?
I think it's a change that only adds to ambiguity in the law and prosecutorial discretion in the law. And some of that's been touched on already. But we absolutely need and frankly must have strong anti-corruption legislation and laws on the books. Absolutely. And this new law weakens that. It also makes it less clear. And
explain what the new law is. What does it do?
So, for those of you who may not be familiar with this, we have there was an ethics law that was passed, comprehensive ethics law, and the legislature recently carved out an exception for economic developers, or in other words, so-called economic developers. And you know, I'm not going to pretend that there weren't some legitimate reasons for the change, but the change that was made doesn't make the law better. In fact, I don't think that the ethics law in general was fairly well written. And the bottom line is that prosecutorial discretion can be dangerous. It can be dangerous when a district attorney, for example, decides that he's going to pursue the highest level offense and the highest sentence for someone of one race and not do that for someone of another race. And I think that goes just as strongly to ethics laws. We have to make sure that those are applied evenly and fairly, regardless of who the individual is, what office they hold, whether they're Republican or Democrat. And I think that goes back to the independence that's required of the office. And like I said, the bottom line is we need strong ethics laws in this state, and it's my firm belief that that change in the law weakened the ability to bring those prosecutions.
Chris, you agree with his definition of what the law is, essentially?
Yeah, so the House Bill 317 changed the ethics law so that someone who was supposed to be a site selector but ended up being a little broader than that, sort of economic development, did not have to register as a lobbyist. I will tell you that some of the descriptions you've heard of the law, it's not as big of a loophole as you would have people believe. It is a loophole. There was an alternative that was suggested, a different way to handle this that involved the Ethics Commission instead of the Department of Commerce, and it would have been a much better way to change the law. And so the legislatures that passed it actually knew it was a bad law, and it sunsets a year after it was passed, forcing the legislature to change it again. So as Attorney General, one of the main things that I will be trying to do is to completely revamp the ethics law, and we will include in there a change to this exception that was made. Now, what is not true, right? So use Mike Hubbard. Mike Hubbard was convicted of 12 felonies. Actually, some of the laws were a little ambiguous, and they changed those in 2016. It would be easier to convict Mike Hubbard today than it was when he was actually convicted, because the changes that were made did not change the laws that he was convicted under. There's still in Section 5 and Section 7 of the ethics law ways that you could prosecute someone who is a site selector trying to bribe a legislator. That's not something that the current ethics law would allow. Again, I think that the ethics law that was passed was too broad, was not well written, needs to be changed, but there's still tools that a prosecutor has that they can address public corruption in those circumstances.
Joe, a question from the audience. Is there a way to avoid lawsuits if the Ten Commandments amendment on the November 2018 ballot gets passed? You got concerns about that?
Well, there's a principle in our country that you must separate church and state. I'm a firm believer obviously a firm believer in the right to practice whatever religion you want in this country. There's a case pending currently, I'm sure some of you heard in the Supreme Court right now, about the so-called Muslim ban. And I think that these are constitutional principles that apply across the country, and they absolutely apply in the state of Alabama. Now, I'm a person who firmly believes in the Ten Commandments, and I believe that those principles, those moral principles, should guide individuals. But having that, not having that distinction and separation, I think is a problem, and it's also unconstitutional.
Chris?
The new Ten Commandments law that passed is clearly unconstitutional. The legislators that passed it knew that when they passed it. And so part of what they did is they prohibited the state from spending any money from defending the law. Which, think about that. Well, who's going to defend the law? As Attorney General, I'm not going to let somebody who doesn't actually work for the state of Alabama and is not somebody that I approve represent the state of Alabama and approve a law and defend a law that we all know is unconstitutional. So the first time that law gets challenged, I as Attorney General will allow it to become stricken just like a court would, because it is unconstitutional. And look, one of the things that you do as Attorney General is you work with the legislature to keep them from doing things like that in the first place. Okay? So that's the persuasive ability that you have as a top law enforcement officer of the state of Alabama.
And this goes back to the overriding principle of the job's about the administration of the law that currently exists, and there are bodies of law in all parts of this. I mean, there are case law. There is state law, municipal law, there's federal law, but the overriding law of our country and frankly of the state of Alabama is the United States Constitution. And we have had elected officials who have forgotten that. Some of our legislators have forgotten that, but the Attorney General cannot forget that.
Chris, a question from the audience. How can you influence the privatization of the prison system?
Private prisons are a problem. I would oppose privatization of the prison system. Everywhere that's been tried, in the long run, it works out worse for the prisoners, and it works out worse for the state that adopts private prisons. As the top law enforcement officer, again, you just have to work with the legislature and the governor and try to convince them. It takes someone who can go and have the ability to persuade people to do the right thing. And so, look, we don't have a private prison problem now in Alabama. They had proposed building all these new prisons, and one of the alternatives was going to be to have private prisons, and that all fell through. Building the new prisons really was just creating an opportunity for income for people who are not doing what they were supposed to be doing. And so we do need to renovate our prisons, but the main thing we need to do is to pull people out of our prisons and put them in other places. We've got a lot of jails, for example, in Alabama. I was in Livingston, and in Livingston they have a jail there that's got 200 places in it. And if you would put prisoners from the state prison, nonviolent offenders there, then they could participate in community activities there, have work, have jobs, and those kind of things. So there's a lot of different things that we can do in Alabama rather than just build new prisons. And the private prisons was just proposed as a way to finance, I guess if you want to think of it that way, private prisons. And it's not a good idea. It's a horrible idea. It's something that I would oppose.
Joe, privatization of prisons, and then also we have a question from the audience talking about whether you would support overturning the law granting food funds going to sheriffs.
Oh wow!
That's a good one.
I'm gonna need at least 20 minutes. Well, to the first question, does anybody here know what an incentive is? Okay. If you tax something, you disincentivize the use, and that's what was done with cigarettes. We should never, in this country, under any circumstances, and absolutely in Alabama, incentivize the incarceration of people.
Amen.
That is exactly what private prisons are. They are profiting off of the incarceration of people.
Yes.
I'm so firmly against that and another reason, these profit-seeking companies, they're going to have lobbyists. We're talking about how we want to move the legislature in the right direction to help get people out of prison. Guess what they're going to be doing if they're here? They're going to be trying to make harder, stiffer penalties to keep more people in prison. And so we need to make sure that the privatization of prisons does not come in Alabama for all those reasons. Now, to the second question.
Come on.
It is absurd, it is obscene, and it is unbelievable that and for those of you who may not be familiar with the issue, there are sheriffs in this state, in their counties, who are allotted certain funds to feed their prisoners. And if the funds that are given to that sheriff's office to feed prisoners is not used for that purpose, then through a loophole, through bad law, they get to pocket the money that's not used. We were just talking about incentives. If a sheriff can pocket money that he's supposed to be using to feed prisoners, and he can either pocket it or feed the prisoners, which one do you think he's going to do? That is a horrible incentive structure, and that is bad law. It's old law. It's got to change. And frankly, and I don't know everything about this issue. I'll admit that, but it is absurd to think that kind of behavior is not illegal. And I believe that some of these sheriffs, through their behavior, may have acted illegally. And I think an investigation through the Attorney General's office is more than appropriate on this issue.
Mr. Christie?
I agree that the way that the sheriff's funds, food funds, are used is horrible. But let me tell you this. I think most of the sheriffs are trying to do their job right, and it's the exception, but it's a horrible exception, and the incentives are all wrong, all right? And so, as a matter of fact, if you study the Etowah County case, part of what was happening is they were using food that said not for human consumption.
Oh my God.
And also expired food. So they were basically getting free food from wherever it was so that they could feed the prisoners. Matter of fact, I heard that there was a time where the prisoners were getting corn dogs for breakfast, for lunch, and for dinner.
That's limestone. Morgan County.
And that there really needs to be an investigation of that. There have been lawsuits in Alabama actually where, for example, in Morgan County was required to provide a nutritionist and a balanced meal, and so the money that the sheriff's offices get is adequate to feed the prisoners. And we need to take away the incentive for the sheriffs to put the money in their pocket and to buy a condo or a house at the beach, right? A $750,000 house at the beach. And so it is a law that needs to change. And unfortunately, Alabama law right now seems to allow that type of behavior. And so it's just one of those areas, again, where the Attorney General probably is the most influential person in the state to get those laws changed, needs to work with the legislature and have that change.
Chris, well, we've got you standing up. How do you plan to stop the state of Alabama from becoming one of the most unethical and corrupt states in the world?
I will tell you that part of my answer to that question is it's too late. There was a professor at Illinois State who did a survey about 2 months ago. It was published, and they ranked the states in the United States which were the most corrupt. And there was a margin. Second and third were really close, but there was a real margin between the first most corrupt state and the second and the third state. Do any of y'all have to guess at what was the most corrupt state in the United States?
Alabama.
Alabama. All right. So we need. All right. Look, my role as Attorney General is not going to be to lock up as many people as possible. Okay? I'm going to lock people up. But the thing that you've got to do is first, you've got to have an ethics law that is understandable and that can be enforced. And then you've got to educate people about what the ethics law is. Most people want to comply with the law. And so you get all the compliance that you can. And then when you get people who won't comply with the law, then you go after them and you lock them up. All right? And so it's going to take a while, right? I don't think the culture in Montgomery, the corruption, the culture that we have in Montgomery is going to change just in 4 years. I really think that it's going to take 8 years of a Democratic Attorney General who will address these issues before we start having change in the corruption that is endemic in Montgomery today.
So do you agree with the study that you're talking about? Do you feel like Alabama is the most corrupt state?
Yeah, I think he touched on a lot of the important topics to discuss there. In Alabama, we are in a moral and ethical crisis. And I don't need to remind everyone in this room that the top office holder in every branch of our government has been removed. It's disgraceful. And I want to echo one sentiment, and this goes back to something I've said earlier is it doesn't matter whether you run as a Democrat or whether you run as a Republican. You got to be an independent in the office, and you got to be independent for this reason, because you got to be able to prosecute corruption wherever it is, and it's all over the place. And I'll be honest with you, if the same wrongs had been committed by Democrats. Now our state is run by Republicans. If these disgraceful acts had been run by or done by Democrats, I think it's the Attorney General's job, even as a Democrat, to step up and make sure that we do not tolerate this type of behavior. There's a lot of work to be done. I will say, and I don't need to remind people in this room, I think that it is incredibly important that these investigations be done fairly, impartially, objectively. And I will make sure that that is the case, and that every prosecution that comes out of my office not only will be well thought out, well investigated, and hopefully successful. There will never be a question of whether or not it was brought for reasons other than an investigation of a crime that needed to be prosecuted.
If in the state of Alabama, your best chance of winning this race is as a Republican, why didn't either of you run as a Republican? Chris, your best chance to win would be as a Republican.
All right. I'll tell something that I haven't told in a public forum. I first started talking to my law partners in January 2017 about running for Attorney General. By the time I got to March, people knew that I was going to run. Twice, I had members of the Republican Executive Committee come to me and try to talk me into running as a Republican. All right? And I told them no. I've been a Democrat all my life, and I was not going to change my priorities, my values, what was important to me to run just to win an office. All right? So I feel like it was important to remain true to who I was. I've been a Democrat all my life. Matter of fact, first time I worked on a statewide Democratic campaign, I was number 3 person on this Senate campaign for a sitting senator, was in 1980. All right? So, not just voting Democratic, but I've been working in Democratic campaigns since 1980. It's what my values are. And look, I know not everybody shares my faith, but I'm a Christian. You ask me who I am, I will tell you that I'm a Christian husband and father who practices law. And when I try to decide whether or not I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, whether I'm following Jesus, right? If I love my neighbor as myself, Matthew chapter 25 tells us that if you are treating these 4 groups of people right, and you're treating Jesus correctly, and it's how Jesus talks about separating the true Christians, the sheep, from those who just claim to be Christians, the goats. And who are those 4 groups of people? Those 4 groups of people are the poor, the sick, the stranger, and the prisoner. The poor, the sick, the stranger, and the prisoner. And which party takes care of those people?
Democrats.
Siegelman, your best chance to win is running as a Republican. Why are you not running as a Republican?
Well, for one, I don't want to get beaten at home. I'm a proud Democrat. I was raised in a family that valued commitment to the public good. And I firmly believe that the Democratic Party is the party that represents that. Like I said, I believe that independence is so important because the Attorney General only has limited opportunities to change the law. Attorney General can't make the law. And that it's incredibly important to execute the laws that are currently on the books in that fair way. And I believe that when you let political considerations get in the way of that, real people are forgotten, real people can get hurt. And so, I believe that you can do that job and not leave your principles at the door. And I'm going to be looking out for the people of this state and to serve their best interests. And the last thing I'll say to this question, I didn't like this question, is I want us to show everybody in the state of Alabama and across this country, and we're talking about being the most corrupt state in the world, show the world that we're not at a disadvantage to run as Democrats.
Right.
That we are the right party because we do stand on the right principles, and for that reason we're going to win in November. Thank you.
So we're at the end of the hour. I know the candidates are going to stick around and be willing to answer questions directly. Thank all of you for coming. Is there any further business we need to conduct tonight?
No, I don't think so.
We appreciate you guys coming to get to know Christie, a name that you knew but you didn't know like this. Mr. Siegelman, an Alabama political name that you know but you didn't know like this. Thanks all of you for coming, and we hope you'll stick around and ask them questions directly and get to know them. You guys are great. Thank you very much.